Hi everybody, I was asked to give a brief overview of signature credit recoupment and why it may deserve to win the Nobel Prize. Let me justify that statement. It's taken me many years to piece all the process together of what's actually going on in the creation of currency, which we all use on this artificial monopoly board that we're playing as the living man woman. We are the players, and the player piece is of course the birth certificate construct, and the relationship between the living man and the birth certificate construct is one of agency. So from the moment the birth certificate was registered by our mum and dad, there was this agency relationship that's been created. Now it's a trap because it causes the living man woman to be the surety for the birth certificate construct, which is obviously sitting on the monopoly board. So if you imagine this artificial monopoly board, everything on that monopoly board is operating in Chapter 11 bankruptcy following House Joint Resolution 192 in 1933. So you've got this real substance, which is the living men and women, and the energy of the living men and women. And then you've got the artificial monopoly board, where everything that we believe is real in this big game of commerce is actually artificial. Not only is it artificial, but everything on the monopoly board itself is operating as a debtor entity in bankruptcy. Now, if you think that you own your house, your car, your business, your stocks and shares, your cryptocurrency, then the problem is that all of those things are actually owned by the, let's just call them the state, the world state. Let's call it the world state. So what they've done in 1933 is they've taken a mortgage out over all of those assets. So those assets sit on the Monopoly Board of Commerce with a mortgage over them. And we, the living men and women who are the agents for the body corporate entities where all of the titles are, so that's the body corporate entity having a title, an equitable title over the assets that are on the Monopoly Board. But all of those assets are registered to the state, the world state. If you look into registration, you'll comprehend that whoever the asset is registered to has the legal title. So what we have with the living men and women have an equitable title. We get to use the assets that are actually in a negative position because everything on the Monopoly Board is a negative because it's all debt-based. So the whole thing is an illusion. What appears to be assets are actually liabilities. Where we want to believe, because all the evidence seems to suggest that we own assets on the Monopoly Board, in fact we don't, because all of those assets are really negative values. They all have a negative value because everything is in bankruptcy and everything is in debt. And because the world state or the cabal took out a mortgage over all of the assets, but they also took out a mortgage over the energy of the people. So that's the energy of the living men and women. Well, how do they transfer that energy, which is coming from the substance, humans, the men and women, the living men and women? How do they transfer that energy onto this big, huge, worldwide Monopoly Board of Commerce? They do it through the birth certificate construct. The birth certificate construct is a banker. It is, if you look at the Bills of Exchange Act of 1882, the birth certificate construct is a person. It's described in the law books as a person. Well, a person, of course, is not a living man or woman. A person is an artificial construct. It's a legal construct. And it is, in fact, a banker. If you look at the Bills of Exchange Act, it describes a body of persons as a banker. So the banker, which is the birth certificate construct, the person, the name that you'll find on the birth certificate, the name that you'll find on the driving license, the bank card, the passport, any other document. That entity is issuing securities because that's what bankers do. So every time a signature is made to make a transaction happen, so that's a bank payment, that's signing for a loan, a credit card, a mortgage, that is basically any use of that signature, even if it's a use by a third party, that creates a negotiable instrument. So the birth certificate entity is issuing a negotiable instrument. That is a promise to pay in the future. Now the banks, the clearing banks, are taking those promises to pay in the future, those negotiable instruments into the system or onto the system. Ex nihilo credit. Now this is what Professor Richard Werner has written exhaustively about, and it's confirmed by the Bank of England and by the Federal Reserve that the credit is created ex nihilo. So when the birth certificate construct, the person creates these negotiable instruments, they are deposited into a clearing bank. The clearing bank then matches that deposit with a matching liability. That's where the debt comes from. So if you think of a balance sheet, the deposit is an asset on one side of the bank's balance sheet, and the bank then creates a matching liability, debt, on the other side of the balance sheet. And that is the debt that is basically the world debt, is made up of the matching liabilities that the clearing banks have put onto the Monopoly Board of Commerce. So we're all trading in negative values. Even though the values appear to be positive, they are in fact negative. So what then happens is the clearing banks, with these debt instruments, these negative value debt liabilities, they basically sell them to the investment banks. And the investment banks that are predominantly operating in New York, in Wall Street, they trade them. And what they're really trading, if you boil it right down, is the energy of the people. Now, every time a negotiable instrument is put on to the Monopoly Board via the person, via the birth certificate construct, that instrument, that promise to pay in the future, is at a zero value because it is human energy. It can't have a monetary value. And of course, everything on the Monopoly Board is a negative anyway. So there is this zero value of the promise to pay, which is a negotiable instrument. And in the realms of original issue discount, the banks are then trading these securities that have a zero value at the creation date, and they are trading them at a future value, which is very high. And the difference between the future value and the value at creation being zero is original issue discount. And that discount, original issue discount, creates taxes. And it's the taxes that the investment banks are paying on these securities, which go to the United States Treasury under the tax module of it's called the 945 tax module. Those taxes that the investment banks are paying belong to the creators of the energy, which of course is the living men and women. But the problem is that the living men and women can't step on the Monopoly Board. It's an artificial Monopoly Board. They can only act as the agent for the birth certificate construct, this person, this banker. Now, where most people go wrong when they start looking into original issue discount is that, and recoupment of signature credit, is that they try and recoup the signature credit from the position of a debtor. So that is the birth certificate construct itself, files tax returns with the United States Treasury, trying to get the signature credit back, or the taxes on the use of the signature credit. And of course the Treasury flags that up as a fraudulent transaction, because the debtor entity, that's the birth certificate construct, cannot recoup signature energy because it is a debtor itself, and it is also registered to the world state or the cabal. So it's their entity, they have the registration of it, and it has no entitlement for tax recoupment. But if you understand the role of nominees, which is very key to the whole process of signature credit recoupment, you can create a grantor trust. So the birth certificate entity, the person, can operate as a grantor for a trust, and that trust can then be established as an international trust with its own tax reference number outside an alien, a foreign alien to the United States system. That trust can then appoint a professional trustee and can also appoint an electronic filing officer or an ERO, electronic reporting officer, as a tax preparer licensed with the IRS. So the trust is now separate from the birth certificate construct. It is operating as a creditor, not as a debtor on the Monopoly Board. So when it files 1099 OID against the 945 tax modules of the investment banks, where the instruments that have been issued following the signature of the living man woman through the birth certificate construct, the clearing banks have sold those securities to the investment banks. The investment banks are paying taxes under their 945 tax modules to the United States Treasury. Those taxes actually belong to the living man or woman, but the living man or woman can't step on the Monopoly Board. So what the living man woman does is it through its principle, which is the birth certificate construct, it creates a grantor trust, appoints a professional trustee, appoints a tax preparer, an ERO, and then the trust itself files 1099 OID. That OID filing is now being done from the grantor trust, which is now the holder in due course of the credit. That's the credit, that's the signature credit, the tax is on the signature credit. And as the holder in due course, as it confirms in IRS publication 1212, it is entitled to the tax recoupment. That is the taxes that the investment bank has paid to the United States Treasury for the use of the credit that originates from the living man woman. The living man woman, through their principle, that's the birth certificate construct, has created a grantor trust, has appointed a trustee, professional trustee, has appointed the tax preparer, the ERO, to file 1099 OID, and then those filings are going to correct the record. The investment bank that has been using the signature credit for its own purposes, to hypothecate it, to multiply it up, which is what the investment banks do with the signature credit. That suddenly now the 1099 OID filing that the grantor trust has filed creates a correction of the record. The ledger now at the United States Treasury now knows, because of the electronic filings, it now knows that the credit, the taxes on the use of the credit, belong to the grantor trust. So the grantor trust is now the rightful owner of the trust of the taxes that are being used by the investment bank, and it's all done very lawfully. Now, this document here discusses all of the different. Sorry, I've got a cat meowing at the door, so I apologise for that. The use of the credit and the taxes paid on it are basically lawfully recouped via the 1099 OID mechanism. The difference between the future value and the current value of the 1099 OID calculation is basically the taxes that the investment bank is paying on their 945 modules, which now belong to, proportionate to the value of the instrument, that's the instrument that was created from the signature, to the grantor trust that is lawfully filed for a correction of the record the investment bank can no longer claim that they are the holder in due course or the creditor, because they never were. So the 1099 OID corrects the record. And so, for example, if it's a mortgage security or a mortgage signature, the filing of the 1099 OID corrects the record, meaning that the grantor trust, the 1099 OID grantor trust, becomes the holder in due course, the creditor. The investment bank that is holding the mortgage security, for example, can no longer claim that it is the creditor. So that's very significant in relation to mortgages. What then happens is, and it's all discussed here, just pick out a few things. Sorry, my cat is still meowing at the door. What then happens is there is a calculation of the original issue discount. At creation, it's a zero value. So the zero value, if you take the future value less the zero value, obviously it's very high. The tax is paid on that discounted value, future value to the issue price of zero, creates a lot of taxes. Those taxes belong to the living man woman, but they can't reclaim them, can't recoup them without setting up the grantor trust as the nominee for the 1099 OID filing. So if you look into the step-by-step process, you've got the Bills of Exchange Act 1882. This is very important because that is confirming that the person, the birth certificate construct, is a banker that is issuing the Bills of Exchange, and it's all described here in this document. Then you've got various UCC references. The UCC is the Uniform Commercial Code. It's all described here, all the different entities and tax reference numbers. And basically then what you then get into is IRS publication 1212, which is telling you that the original issue discount is the holder in due course is entitled to the taxes being paid on the energy. That's really what IRS publication 1212 is really telling you from a signature credit recoupment point of view. But it can't be used, which is where people have made massive mistakes. IRS publication 1212 will only work if the nominee for the true creditor, which is the living man woman, is filing the tax returns. So the nominee now becomes the grantor trust that is being created to put in the tax filings to the United States Treasury. That's all described here. This is the 1099 OID references, which boxes are completed, etc., etc. So now you've got this situation where all of the investment banks have got they are filing taxes to the United States Treasury every year under the what is known as the omnibus tax accounts, or the 945 tax accounts. These filings are basically for the rental of the signature credit or the energy of the living men and women. They file these taxes to the United States Treasury every year. So all of the investment banks in New York that are using the signature credit filing taxes under the 945 tax module, and it's from that tax module that the signature credit is recouped. So here we have some of the big investment banks and how much they are paying in different years for their 945 tax returns. So what you've got now is you've got a situation where you've got billions of taxes being paid under the 945 tax returns. All of those taxes actually belongs to the true creditors. That's the living men and women. And very interestingly, you've also got, if you go back here, you've got a lot of taxes being paid on other tax modules. So you've got a huge amount of taxes which are not on the 945 tax module. But that's very significant because the 945 tax module has a priority over all of the other tax modules. So for example, if the Republic of Old Souls envoys are recouping, let's say, just easy numbers, $1 billion, add all the recoupments up for 1 year, and it's $1 billion, if the investment banks that are related to that $1 billion have not paid sufficient on the 945 tax modules, then the taxes on other modules can be moved over to the 945 tax module. So what you have basically is you have a priority. The 945 tax module has a priority claim over the taxes that the investment banks are paying. And it's confirmed because the grantor trust is operating under fiduciary rights, it can command the IRS under Revenue Procedure 2002-2026. It can command the IRS to move taxes from the other tax modules onto the 945 tax module, which will then support the signature credit recoupment. And this is an example here of what is known as cross-modular transfer. So you've got investment banks like JP Morgan that have paid 138 million on their 945 tax return. But let's suppose that the envoys of the Republic of Old Souls recoupments are greater than 138 million under the JP Morgan Chase. What can happen then is that the trustee of each of the grantor trusts can command the IRS under this Revenue Procedure 2002-2026. Excuse me, my cat is making a lot of noise. Can command the IRS to move taxes from the other tax modules, this tax module here, onto this tax module here, and therefore being sufficient to finance the recoupments of the signature credit via the 945 tax returns. And it's perfectly lawful. You can actually go and read this for yourself. Revenue Procedure 2002-2026. What you've then got is you've got the IRS algorithm, which basically is looking at the whole A through Z process. So this is the algorithm 810. Now the IRS employs this algorithm to make sure that the signature credit from the clearing bank through to the investment bank onto their 945 module, all of the securities that the signature credit has been recorded under have been recorded under the right tax modules, and the whole process A through Z must check out compliantly. And the IRS use our algorithm 810 to check all that out. So what we do, and what the electronic filing officer and the trustee does, is we run our own calculations to make sure that everything is compliantly filed for, and it's already verified before the actual recoupment, which is done via a 1041 tax return, is actually filed at the Treasury. So everything is cleared before there's even any recoupment claim made, which is done via the tax return 1041. And it's all in here, the information master file. So the IRS has got this very big database. It knows everything already. And if you try and file something which is incorrect, it will know that, and it will freeze the recoupment through the TC810 freeze. So that's why we check everything out. Now we've actually built an AI system which tracks all of the signature credit energy from the clearing bank, that's from the creation of it, through the clearing bank, through the investment bank, onto the securities that the investment banks are trading, into the investment bank's 945 tax modules. The whole process is tracked and identified by the algorithm that we've built to achieve this process and make sure it's compliant, so that there is no problem when the electronic reporting officer files the 1041 tax return. There can be no problem with that recoupment because everything is being checked out by this algorithm that we've built in advance. So we're not, the trustee isn't, and the electronic reporting officer isn't filing, and hoping that the IRS is going to finance the recoupment and transfer the recoupment on ACH or Fedwire. We already know because the algorithm's already checked it all out. Now a lot of people have said, is it going to bankrupt the Treasury? if we recoup, billions of signature credit every year, is it going to bankrupt the Treasury? And I actually wrote a whole research report on this a few weeks ago. The bottom line is it's never going to bankrupt the Treasury, because the Treasury itself creates currency ex nihilo. They basically get they have a relationship with the Federal Reserve, and between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, they create ex nihilo credit out of nothing. So in a very similar way to what we're all doing, creating credit through our signature, well, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve do the same thing. They can create unlimited currency, which is what they do. So the recoupment of taxes is just a redirection of ledgers, really. You've got to remember that there's no money of substance. It's only ledgers. There's no safe somewhere, or there's no great big depository backed by gold or anything like that. It's just ledgers. So the recoupment of the taxes is just a ledger correction, and it doesn't bankrupt the Treasury whatsoever. If you look at the synthesis of the Clifford Protocol, which is the name I've given this process, I'm Ian Clifford, by the way, if you didn't know. Recognition, the issue price that's the issue price of 0 of the signature credit at the beginning. You've got the OID identifiers, that's all in the securities, it's in the CUSIP numbers, it's in the other reference numbers. You've got the identification of the nominees, and then you've got a new nominee, which is the nominees of the investment banks. And then you've got a new nominee, which is a grantor trust, which is going to do the tax filings. And then you've basically got a redirection. You've got a correction of the nominee filings, which corrects the record at the United States Treasury, moving the taxes from the existing, the presumed nominee, which is the investment banks, paying the taxes on that 945 tax module, onto the grantor trust, which has been established as the lawful nominee for the true creditor being the beneficiary of the grantor trust. And that's the whole process. It's lawful. It is, a lot of people have said to me that, piecing all that together and joining all the dots up and then creating a process which is perfectly lawful, which can recoup signature credit. A lot of people have said to me, Ian, that's a work of genius. Now, I'll let you judge that for yourself. What you can do with this is combine this with the Asset Fortress Protocol. So once the signature credit has been recouped into the grantor trust, the tax filing grantor trust, it can then be moved by way of a grant into an Asset Fortress Protocol, which is another grantor trust which will act as your private treasury. And then what happens is the Asset Fortress Protocol spends, i.e. issues negotiable instruments, signature credit, and recoups them back. So it can be a spend and recoupment cycle, completely transforming the game of Monopoly, because remember, it is just an artificial game. So what you've got here is an opportunity to recoup abandoned signature credit from the age of majority. You can then that will then be moved into the Asset Fortress Protocol, spend and recoup it from there. You'll never have to earn new or create. If you don't want to, you'll never need to create new or put new energy onto the Monopoly board. You can spend and recoup the existing energy. Just think of the bank payments, mortgages, credit cards, loans that you've used your signature to create since the age of majority, the age of 18 or 21. If you look at the other things like deductions from wages, payroll, W1, W2, PAYE, whatever it's called in the country you're in, all of those deductions are signature credit. You're sitting today probably on many millions of dollars of signature credit recoupment, which you could bring back into your Asset Fortress Protocol, spend it and recoup it. Thank you for watching.